Okay, I'm going to make a few introductory remarks because not everybody knows the people here. Firstly, in opening government, we have two National University of Singapore students, ex-student. They are lawyers now, and they work in some of the biggest firms in Singapore. The one that is better looking is Imran. The one that is the best looking is Robin. So you decide. Okay? Robin is recently single and is available. Imran's girlfriend is one of the most important influencers in Singapore. Her name is, I'm not going to say her name, okay? And it's very important for you to know this, that they came to Macau about 8 years ago, and they won the United Asian Debating Championship here. So it's like a homecoming for this duo, and we're very glad for them here. If anything, all of them have already won $1,000, which everybody gets. If you're a champion, you get 2,000. So the casino just around the corner. Okay. Opening up the best debater from Hong Kong. The Sam Chan is the ESL champion at the Manila Worlds in 2015. The Sam Chan, with the one with the glasses. Sam has finished his master's and has been given a scholarship to do his PhD in political history. Like, where's Brian Wong? Who refused? Where's Brian Wong? So there's Sam Chan with the glasses. Ian Wu was in the semi-finals of the World School Debating Championship, the highest that Team Hong Kong has attained, and he was a top 10 speaker in the Germany World School Debating Championship, and he was the semi-finalist in the Mexico World University Debating Championship, and he was the champion of the HWS that was held in Geneva in HWS. So that's the opening up. They are the best debater from Hong Kong. Please join us to congratulate them. Closing government, we have Ben Jackson and Daniel Drummer, who just turned 28. They are the reigning University of Malaya Austria champion. For Maguire, the first time that a small university has broken the stranglehold of the University of Sydney or Monash or whoever that is strangling Austria championship. So they are inspiring story, and Macquarie deserve a place at the high table here. In closing up, we have a kid. This guy has not gone to university yet, but he's slated to go to university in Stanford. He's a world champion. Team Singapore debater, world champion in 2015 in Singapore. So Singapore organized it and we won it. It's just dirty tricks, right? Okay. Okay, and then that's him. That's Arthur Lee. I'm not happy with him because his parent has a restaurant in Shanghai, but I was never invited there. Although he has been to Shanghai twice, he always invites his friends and Mrs. Gita Craftfield. Of course, the most inimitable and the most well-known height challenge debater in the world is Mr. Lee Chin Hui. Ex-Team Singapore debater, Oxford Team B, and best speaker in HWS this year. Am I remembering everybody correctly? And when he was in the Shanghai International Debate Championship, he delivered the best speech that ever people have done. I think he got 91 in the finals, although his teammate let him down. Who was the teammate then? The teammate is there letting people down. Okay, let me introduce the most illustrious, universally great judges that we have gathered for you. The chair is Professor Joseph Park from Harvard University. Then we have Harish from Cambridge, Oxford, and wherever he was from again. And what? Pat? No. That's MDG, right? Then we have Miloš from Belgrade University. Gigi from Leiden University. Then we have I can't pronounce. Can you give me a name again? Huh? Clean from Harvard Law School. And finally, Bobby Liet from Stanford University. Oh, no, you don't care. And of course, the Queen of Mermaids, Shamila Pratmanan. I now leave the proceeding to the chair. Joshua, please.
All right, welcome to the grand finals of the 2018 Macau Tournament of Champions. Opening government, we have Bishan. Opening opposition, de jure, de facto. Closing government, Macquarie. And closing opposition, Wise Gamora. Everything else has been introduced, and everyone has been introduced. On the motion, this House regrets the westernization of the elites in post-colonial countries, with a bunch of examples. I invite the Prime Minister to the podium to deliver the speech.
Sorry, give me a minute, my boss just texted me.
Please turn off your mobile phones or put them on silent.
All right, shall we? Like Lok said, Robin and I are Asian debaters from NUS. We had some success, I guess, with in world universities and WDCs. We went to quarters and we went to octos. That was fine, I guess. But when it came to speaker tabs, right? As in, I had to scroll down quite a fair bit to find myself. I didn't think that the rankings necessarily represented how good I was at those tournaments, but I was facing a challenge. Every time I got into a room, just because I did not have the right team name, I was from NUS, National University of Singapore. It wasn't Oxford or Cambridge, even though a Singaporean in those schools might do better. Or I didn't speak English the right way. We just didn't get as high scores as other people did. In fact, it was in vogue at that point in time for Singaporean debaters to speak in British accents and cite Tacitus. But we made it a point of principle, both Robin and I, that we will stick to how we sound, that we won't try and engage you in deep philosophical discussions. We will do the Asian NUS thing and give you as many examples as we possibly can, and hopefully that works. Because to us, it mattered that we push through this idea that you can come from NUS and be successful. That you can come from a Singapore university, that you don't need Stanford or Oxford or the Cambridge flag in order for you to do well. And that's where we came from. And that's why this, in my last debate speech ever, it holds some special significance. Now, I understand I need substantives, so here they come. The first one, why we think the westernization is bad, because it locks in money classes. The poorest and those who don't have access to passports cannot access the same privileges that the elites who fetishize everything that is Western can possibly access. So what do you then do here? Just because you're not an Oxford gentleman or you don't speak English the right way, people don't want to do business with you. People would rather do business with someone who has had experience working for Bain in the United States or the United Kingdom, a Singaporean who has worked in the US for 5 to 8 years. But if you're an individual in Singapore, because you have a Singlish accent and you've not had experience outside that, it is far less likely that someone wants to engage with you when the other alternative is a person that they can more relate to, someone that they possibly have met in those cities like London or like New York. You lock in the money classes. The poorest can't get the same thing. They can't go to Stanford, they can't go to Oxford, they can't get the same business opportunities. We get it. There are things like bursaries and educational grants and scholarships. But even then, there's a very small number of people there who can possibly benefit from that, and you can't break free from the classification or the stratification of these people. What we rather have is something like India. In India, the new classes are starting to repudiate the Indians who speak with a colonial accent. That's why the leaders of like Mukesh Ambani or people like Chinakanan, Sivasankaran, big Indian corporate leaders have a very distinct Indian accent, and they're very proud about that. So why is that better? Because then you establish a form of commonality between the elites and the poorer classes. It gives them an opportunity to try and compete against the elite classes on the quality of their ideas, as opposed to having the right affiliations. We don't want to lock in and classify the existing classes. Secondly, the imposition of white supremacy. West is best. That if you're from the Ivy League, you're a better student than someone coming from a Singaporean university. And this is a self-perpetuating cycle, because these people then subsequently go on to take all the top positions in media outlets, in top government positions as well. So it self-perpetuates this idea that as long as you keep going to these universities or keep having the kind of experiences in the West, you will be better, because that's where they came from as well, and they would like to think that they're of higher quality there. So we think that's a problem, right? Because local businesses then can't develop, because they don't have the right associations, because they don't have the right experience, the right people leading them. They can't compete on an even keel with these other individuals. Now, how about the Obama concept of once you've climbed the ladder, you give your hand down? The problem with that is that the westernized elite feel greater affinity for people, the friends in London, in comparison to the poorest people in Singapore, because their shared experiences have been accumulated there. That's where they went to school. That's where they had crazy nights out in pubs. They cannot identify or find some form of affinity with the people who went to the kopitiam in Tampines or Ang Mo Kio. To them, they feel a closer affinity with other people, and therefore don't see the need for them to extend their hand down and necessarily help other individuals. The third argument that I have here is that there is a political consequence here. In terms of human rights, what happens? The lexicon of human rights is predominantly rooted in Western language and Western ideas. It's difficult and almost impossible in some countries for you to express the same ideas in their indigenous tongue because of its origins. So that's why in China, you find a lot of people struggling to push for their rights, because you don't have the kind means of political expression concerning human rights in the Mandarin language. They can't access that. You're talking about the people who most require access to such advocacy, who most require the need to be able to express themselves and what exactly that they need. And we think that's terribly problematic. Yes. Yes, it does, but there is the problem, right? The fact that you need translation means that you need people who will be able to afford translators, means that you want to calcify a system where people cannot access it unless they made themselves more Western and they subscribe to those languages, and we think that's a problem. The last point here is that you destroy anything that's autochthonous. And I'm going to talk about adat law as an example here. So in order for them, because there is this predilection for everything that is Western, they try to fit it into Western forms. This includes things like laws. In Indonesia, adat law is spread by oral tradition, right? And they try to fit that according to the circumstances of the time. What they then tried to do, the new ruling class in Indonesia, because they want to be far more westernized, is that they made it into statutory law. Now that's a problem, because adat law and its oral tradition cannot be applied the same way you apply statutory law. And what this does is that you completely destroy autochthonous law and destroy every identifying marker of what makes that local and what makes that good. And we find it a problem, because what we rather have do is preserve the cultural aspects and the self-identifying things that make these Asian cultures exceptionally unique. And for all those reasons, ladies and gentlemen, I'm extremely proud to propose.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for your speech. And now to respond on behalf of opening opposition, let's hear from Leader of Opposition. Here.
Testing. Okay. Coming from CHK, an institution that is even less well-known than NUS, I could exactly feel what Imran feels in his speech. However, I could also recognize that my experience in Worlds and other tournaments would be even worse if Ian did not go to Cambridge and debated in these international tournaments on behalf of Cambridge. That aside, what we want to argue here is that decolonization is a long-term process. Very often, countries and states that have gotten off formally and legally off colonization are still colonized in many other aspects afterwards. What we are talking about is that, for example, positions of court, positions of company, positions in schools and are all still held by people from Britain, from America, from these ex-colonizers. But more importantly, we also say that very often cultural norms are still dictated by these countries as well, precisely because people have grown up under the influences of these colonies. We also argue that very often trading has already been predetermined, where most of the trading with, let's say, Hong Kong is with Britain and with other colonizers, or under the system of these colonizers. But lastly, that these countries find themselves entering into a global structure which is already predictated by these countries which once colonized them for the past 200 years. What we are going to argue to you is that the only way and the best way for these states to survive and to move on and to attain a certain sense of relative autonomy and prosperity for different individuals alike in these societies, the only way forward is by sending the elites into westernized institutions and cultures, and we do not regret that at all. Rebuttals, integrators. So firstly, how does this help us actually to decolonize? Because I first want to contest against the characterization that Imran made on two levels. Firstly, we argue to you that very often these people do not just feel that, oh, they're British or that they're American, because the very fact that they come from Hong Kong or they come from Singapore means when they go to Oxford, they cannot just claim that, oh, I am British too, because the fact is that they come from Hong Kong or they come from Singapore. And very often it's precisely that juggling with different kinds of identities that force them to find a narrative that fits into both identities, and it means mixing things that are specifically from Hong Kong, Singapore into their identity. But secondly, we also argue to you that it is not true that these people have no relational ties with these places at all. After all, it is their home that they grow up very often for the first 18 years of their life before they enter into university. Very often, a lot of these elites do come back. And thirdly, very often these elites do enter into different cultural spheres and help mix certain indigenous narratives that help counter against other different spheres as well. And therefore, translation for human rights do exist for the other people who did not go to these westernized universities. And how does this fit into my arguments? So firstly, we argue to you, to the extent that impacts of colonization still exist, we need mechanisms to counter that. How do we get that on our side of the house? Firstly, we argue to you that very often these elites, by wait, which argument is this? All right, so very often these elites, by bringing back values with their own choice, means that they will be able to develop narratives such as, for example, the East meets West in Hong Kong, which allows them to change their culture in a way that no longer only blindly follows the West, but where they can maintain some relative distance with the West and yet twist the culture in a way that also fits into the experiences of these indigenous population that grew up in the influences of the West. The other way doesn't help. If you just say, oh, we want to emphasize the local culture that is at odds with the experiences of most people who exactly grew up under the influences of British. And therefore, we argue to you that we need to create a new national identity based on both the history of colonization, but the history of local histories that are undermined by colonization. And this is the only thing you can do when you have people who have experiences both. But secondly, we also argue to you that very often we are talking about economic negotiation. We are talking about judicial negotiation. And it's these individuals who have education from the West, who are, let's say, Oxford or Harvard top scholars, which are very unfortunately recognized by the world and recognized by these cities themselves as being better people or better institutions that are able to replace or negotiate with people who are currently in positions. That is where we can see people who constantly fill in the previously Western judges that are holding court positions in Hong Kong with people who are initially from Hong Kong but have studied, let's say, in Oxford or Harvard. And we think that is already better because these people at least have more concern over local interests. But we need to make that comparative where they do not have elites going overseas. We don't know how are they able to negotiate with the West or how they're going to able to negotiate with the core. We think they are less likely to be able to develop a distinctive culture, recognizing that influences of colonization happen and apply also on their side as well. They need to tell us how they counter that. But secondly, we also tell you that the additional effect we get from this is that you strengthen resistances for democracy and liberalism. Why is that a crucial thing? Because very often, post-colonial states like to emphasize their victory in fighting against colony, and like to say that it is precisely because of that we need strongman states. And very often that means a recession of human rights and a recession of different kinds of things that we have already gotten. And that is why we need a diversity of elites that can speak otherwise. But before I go on, closing.
When you grow up believing that the best thing for you to do is go overseas and only consuming Western media and being taught primarily in English, I agree you might know your culture, but how are you able to have any respect or gratification for that culture?
We believe the difference here we are making is that, A, we argue to you that westernization doesn't mean buying it wholesale, but secondly, we also argue to you because there are also other people who did not go into those places, and the elites also have to take them into account. Later on, explain more in my last argument. But we argue to you right now that it's important that we have elites that live and experiences these values overseas, experiences of human rights, experiences of democracy, and they come back and feel a gap in the experiences of living when they work, let's say, in Hong Kong. And that is where they are able to make narratives, and this is where they will try to mobilize more people to support their narrative, and that is exactly why translation exists, that this allows states to easily slip back into authoritarianism, just like how Duterte did in Philippines. We argue to you this is where we create more spots and sites of resistance to prevent democracy from worsening or prevent states from killing people that ignoring completely human rights. But lastly, we also argue to you that this benefits different sets of individuals. It not only benefits the people who went overseas because it gives them a wider access, that no longer locks them into one specific country that happened just arbitrarily born in. But secondly, we also argue to you that it is also better for individuals who did not go there as well, because very often it is precisely because elites went away that is where the state can free up more limited welfare and resources for people who stayed. If all the elites stayed in Hong Kong, I'm not even sure if I can get into CUHK or not. And it's this precise fact that allows more people to move up the social ladder because they're able to utilize the existing welfare resources that exist in these post-colonial cities. But lastly, we also argue to you by allowing a large sum of individuals to be able to negotiate with different MNCs in the world because they share similar culture or because they share similar language, you allow these cities to compete a lot more effectively, plus creating a trickle-down effect for these people as well. Ladies and gentlemen, post-colonials live a hard life in the world economy and culture. We need mechanisms for them to survive. We provide the mechanisms. Very proud to oppose.
And now to continue the case for opening government, let's hear from Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Note that in that speech, the speaker before me seemed to think that the best thing that can happen to these societies is they adopt liberalism, a Western concept rooted in the Western experience. The best thing that can happen to these individuals is if they attend good institutions approved of by the West. That is precisely the problem, that the West has been allowed to determine the lexicon of what success means. That even if you were to succeed, it is on the terms of the West. That is precisely what that speech has demonstrated implicitly as well. 2 points of substantive. Firstly, that you actually decimate the ability of people outside the elite to access the levers of power and to access institutions that are meant to help you exist in a modern society. And second, their policy choice, it limits the policy choices of elites and countries as well. But before that, a few points of rebuttals. Firstly, this last-minute idea that we need more people to go overseas so that the leftovers can be left to the locals who are poorer as well. And that's precisely the problem. If your elites were to go to Harvard and Oxford, they come back and feel no affinity whatsoever for those who A, don't go to universities, or B, go to local universities as well. That is when policy choices that does not take into account the interests of those below, that is when policy because they feel no affinity for those who cannot speak English or French arises as well. But second, that case ignores the fact that if there was an indigenous local culture and a strong, vibrant educational system based on that local language, then there will be better universities in these societies based on local culture as well, that more people can already access to begin with. It is precisely because the richest parents, the most privileged parents, don't want to send their kids to local universities, that local universities never actually develop, never actually gain the heft and reputation necessary in order to become an elite university. Next idea, this idea that that most of these people are not assholes. They come back, they try to fit a Western narrative with the local narrative as well. And sure, there will be some post-colonial heroes that try to do that. But those are not the people we're talking about. We're not talking about Gandhi that attempted to fuse it. It is the elite that falls in their wake as well. The individuals who care primarily about their own self-interest and end up being businessmen, end up joining politics as well. So even if you can point to individual heroes who actually want and care about those below them, that does not apply to the vast majority of the elite. But we would say that this point is uncomparative as well. because we think that if these elites were to actually be focused on indigenous culture to begin with, they will never have an identity crisis and have to try to fuse the lived experiences of people in their country with people 10,000 leagues away who do not actually have any connection with them to begin with. The reason why this is better is that the narrative that these individuals construct will be linked to the actual lived experiences of people on the ground. Sure, there are indigenous elites as well, but if you are if you are a Chinese on the ground, at the very least, if you speak the same language as your political leader, you're better able to connect with politics and the social norms in your country as well. On the comparative, that is better. Next, human rights and liberalism. Like I said in my introduction, it is telling that they think that the best thing to happen to these societies is to effectively become a weaker version of the West. But they claim that there is translation. The lexicon of human rights can be imported into this country. But that ignores the nuance of Imran's point, that for human rights to succeed, it must be rooted in the lived experiences and the cultures of this country as well. And when all you're doing is translating, human rights will not be as resonant, assuming it's a good thing, in these countries as well. But more than that, it means that human rights campaigners in these countries will always be tainted as Western stooges. That is why individuals in certain countries that I will not name resort to Asian values in order to justify authoritarian governments in these countries as well. That is a direct consequence of human rights being a Western concept and elites caring only about them from a Western point of view. But more than that, they say that the norms are dictated by the West, and so for these individuals to succeed, people must be able to understand the West and interact with the West. Firstly, that's precisely the problem, that what is successful is determined by the West, that Africa is only successful if they become more like Europe, for instance. This means that local indigenous cover never developed to determine their own metric of success. They never developed their own universities, own institutions to determine what is and isn't good for that country. We think that's bad. Lastly, moving on to my substantive. Firstly, accessing the institutions of power. To put it simply, most societies have institutions that are meant to enable people to access the halls of power or in order to let them better life. Things like courts, for instance, whereby you can secure your rights. The problem here is that when your courts and elite institutions are based on a completely foreign language, it is immensely difficult for someone who does not know that language to access the institution. I can tell you now in my line of work that anyone who doesn't speak English in Singapore is terrified of going before the court because it is so profoundly alien to her, because it is constructed by post-colonial elites who studied in the West as well. What this means is that people would rather not access the institutions of state, would rather not access the court, for instance, to vindicate their rights because they do not think the courts speak for them. We think that is harmful for every individual who are not lucky enough to grow up speaking English, who are not lucky enough to have an English education in many of these countries, and we think that is immensely harmful. Before moving on, I will take closing.
Yeah, I think what you forget is that for many post-colonial countries, they operate within a superstructure where business opportunities and economic opportunities come predominantly from former colonies.
That's the problem, for instance. They never look towards other business opportunities that may not come from the West. For instance, if you're Chinese, you know that there's a whole Chinese market, Chinese business market, which is never accessed by the West. And the problem here is that people never think to look at alternative ways in which business can be done, alternative ways in which success can be defined as well, thereby calcifying the very Western supremacy that we think is such a bad thing. Lastly, this policy also leads to bad political choices. To put it simply, post-colonial states sometimes need to take action against the interests of the very colonial powers that they derive, that they come from. The problem here is that it is immensely difficult for them to do so when the elites make weekly trips to London or Paris, when they feel more of an affinity for their friend in college rather than their fellow men. For instance, Haiti has been decimated by America and France over the years. But every single member of the Haitian elite actually studied in either France or the United States, feel an affinity to France and the United States. And as such, the political class in Haiti could never conceive of moving away from the influence of the West and reaching out to other countries that could potentially benefit them more because the cultural affinity is not there. That is what I mean, because the lexicon of which you determine yourself and situate your identity is situated around your upbringing and the West. You're also incapable of making policy choices for your government that benefits your country as well. That harms almost everybody in that country. For all these reasons, we think that we would rather have a world where indigenous culture is prized as well. I'm immensely proud to propose.
And now to conclude the opening half debate, I invite the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to the podium where He is all ready to deliver his speech when he's ready.
Good. I think what's unfortunately sorely lacking from what otherwise is a beautiful opening government case is how the world would look like on their side of the house. If, this is a regrets motion, if we put ourselves back 80 years into, a world where, countries were coming out of colonialism and they somehow, let's say, were posed with this decision, would you become a westernized type of state, or would you be one that locks itself in and keeps to its own traditions? And we say the most difficult thing about the Gov case here is they need to show us how exactly that world would look, how the economy would look, how the governance would look, how people would interact with each other in that world. And what we say on opening opposition, and something quite new from my speech, is I'm going to give you some historical context and show you why countries coming out of colonialism would have been a hell of a lot worse on their side of the house had they not been outward looking and instead looked within. So first of all, historical institutions and how the world would have looked like before. I think the important thing to note, this is a regrets motion, right? Which means you have to really put yourself back into the time when this decision was actually being made. At the end of the Second World War, the remnants of the administrations of a lot of these colonialist governments, all across Africa, all across Asia, they had in those places, universities, they had administrations, they had bureaucracy, they had so much infrastructure that was set up there to which the country functioned upon. It was also that these countries were created based on this, right? Like the ethnic divisions of how those countries have been carved out within Africa, all of these were decided by the West, by Western thinkers, by Western leaders and philosophers. The key distinction here on the comparative is, would it be better if we had people who ran these countries being people who were educated in the West, who understood the West, understood what they were trying to do in the past when they created these administrations, or is it better to fill them up with people who didn't have that idea? And we think it's a lot better on our side of the house. The reason is, when you have institutions that are not funded by, are not staffed by people who know how to operate them, who know how to operate the industry, who know how to, trick the, walk the line, the fine line between the different ethnic classes. You end up getting civil wars, you get civil strife, you get the breaking of nations. It's why the most insular nations and the most aggressive decolonizing nations tend to be the ones to do the worst. Whereas you get people like Lee Kuan Yew, who went to Cambridge, studied the maths and got the senior wrangler, who then went back to Singapore, using the ideas he learnt from the West and a Western approach towards governance that created the incredible nation that spawned half of the debaters in this room. So, a good example of this, I think, that's not Singapore is Senegal, right? I sadly don't remember the name of the leader who founded Senegal, but from what I know, from the Wikipedia page I read, he went to France, for a long time, lived there for a long time, and when at the end of World War II, he went back to Senegal. Because of what he had learnt within France and how France operated, and most crucially the values of French governance, which something I'm going to go on to later on, he was able to convince the French to let go of the nation, and he filled that nation and its administration with people who were westernized and understood how that administration had functioned before. He further went on to recruit more people who did the same thing to create an institution that was staffed by people from the West. It was that westernized ideal that enabled the nation to flourish and become one of the most successful African nations we have today. But okay, let's take ourselves out of history books and into the world, right? Why do we still want a westernized version of these states? One, because of democracy and liberalism. Last time I was in the grand finals, I had to defend my democracy is good. I am so glad to do so again. No, thank you. So one, because we think that a lot of the basic rights that we afford people can be, can come from things like democracy and come from these kinds of values. Now here's the thing, right? I think the problem here is it is true that it is arbitrary that the West was the first to develop democracy. But the important thing is they were the ones who did develop it. And we suggest that in the wake of colonialism and how it structured those countries, a democratic governance that included all people and encompassed the views of all people, that had things like rule of law to settle out conflicts between disputes between different people of different classes, no thank you, different religions, different ethnicities, is actually the best way of governance within these fractured countries. You have things like welfare, things like the socialist ideal that was set up in France and England that enabled people, no thank you, to understand the need to help the people who are poor and people who are disenfranchised within those countries. These are things that are much more easily gained when you have a Western elite who goes to those places and understands why they're good things, like the people here, for instance, who understand the value of democracy, at least to some extent, even if the Gov team might say that democracy is useless. No thanks. Economics, secondly, it creates an economically better future for these countries, right? No thanks. I think the key to this argument is basically to say that, again, it is arbitrary that the West was the one that developed first and became the rich nations that they are today and were at the time of post-colonial, of the, the overthrow of colonial rule. But the fact of the matter is, these countries, I'll take you in a second actually, the fact of the matter is these countries were where the economic rights and resources and all of that kind of stuff was, which means in order to tap into that and to achieve the fastest growth and to lift the most people out of the crippling poverty they find themselves in poor nations meant that tapping into those economies meant trying to understand how these economies were set up, being able to have ties and relationships with these people that could be argued on a ground where you understood what the West was trying to gain out of you. It meant you not being robbed by the West when they would come with their, ideals of how economies run, when the reality is just trying to rob you because you don't understand the approach to economics that Western thinkers have had, and unfortunately the world is based upon because they just happen to be so rich. Also, see Sam's argument about resources and why you free up resources for people when they leave the country. Yeah.
Both Rwanda and the DRC had elites who studied in Belgium. Did that really stop ethnic and tribal strife in those countries?
I mean, okay, sure. Of course you can pinpoint these nations, right? We say that if there was better integration of this, maybe it would have turned out better. And we say Rwanda still has a huge, Rwanda's doing very well now, right? After all that ethnic strife. And it seems to be because it particularly has an open-minded view on the world. So the second argument to prove is why people will come back, right? Which I think responds to a lot of what the opening government case be. They claim, people won't come back, they'll leave to the West, we get none of the benefits, right? One, okay, maybe this is true. They have to tell why comparatively in their world, that's actually worse. I think it's important to note. Second of all, we think they will come back, and there are a lot of reasons. One, because cultural ties, right? Even if you're westernized, I'm westernized, I speak English like this, right? But I still feel a very close connection to Hong Kong, and that's because, even if I am westernized, I can still have a multicultural kind of approach to life. But second of all, it's because you have advantages going back, right? If you're part of the elite from the country you come from, you're probably a lot more likely to be able to gain a happy and a rich and a comfortable life in those particular places, which means you're likely to go back and likely to develop those, opportunities that are there. The impacts of this, right, is we prove not just that the elite benefit, but the people below also benefit, because the trickle-down effect. And I think it's something that's starting to bear fruition now, right? Countries like Hong Kong, South Korea, countries like Singapore are really becoming, catching up with the West precisely because of the approach they took all this time ago. So I'm just responding to the opening government team because I think most of my case deals with it in that they can prove that, people might be somewhat less happy, but if we can prove those countries actually, get out of civil conflicts or, have a better economy, those are probably things that weigh more in this debate. But they tell you it locks in class. I mean, initially, probably, right? You can't really go into the West if you happen to be poor. But all of Sam's analysis and my analysis proves why over time that actually changes, and you actually are able to break out of that. And that's why you see even people from the middle, even lower classes in places like Hong Kong and Singapore are actually able increasingly to go to the West to study, through things like scholarships, through things like the fact that they're just getting economically more empowered. And I think that's a crucial thing when you talk about economic empowerment and how that relates to everybody, not just the elite, being able to prosper. So when they talk about regret, right, I think that I think the government teams in this debate really need to consider how exactly colonialism functioned, how a world that didn't have this motion would look like, but also have to contend with our arguments about why it makes the world a lot better place and people can be a lot happier. Very proud to oppose.
Moving to the closing half, I'd like to invite the member of government to continue the debate. I'd also like to remind all of the speakers who are delivering POIs to use their microphones, otherwise it's not picked up by the recordings.
Opening opposition defends diversity in principle. The problem is they ignore the way in which people rank their cultures in their minds and throughout their societies. They also detail for us the huge starting gate advantage enjoyed by colonial countries within this cultural context, but they do not explain why post-colonial states should embrace those lingering institutions that still cast a shadow over those countries and distort their paths to prosperity and self-determination. We think we should reject that influence. We think it is problematic, and at Macquarie we're going to prove two things. First, how this retards the development of Indigenous institutions, both passively and actively, and second, how it is effectively colonialism by stealth in the way it encourages these countries to rank themselves as inferior to their former colonial post-colonial masters. Rebuttal will be integrated as I go. So first, how does it retard the development of Indigenous institutions? The first thing is that it puts in place people, Western educated people, who do not regard those Indigenous institutions as valuable as their fellow countrymen might, those who are not sent to those foreign institutions, which is a form, we think, often of internalised racism. That is to say, they aspire to things that are exogenous to their culture rather than indigenous to it. Second of all, this practically destroys culture because the elites who end up governing that country are less likely to have learned it. Yes, they might still know some facts, and yes, they did not achieve their entire education overseas, but it is obviously the case that as a proportion and as a class, they have a less of a value of that culture and less information about it. Thirdly, we would say it diminishes the confidence of a society, which is one of a society's most important assets, because the ability to attract talent into the public service and the arts, and in fact any local industry, requires a belief that your culture is worthwhile, a pride in your culture, and a sense that it is worthwhile in and of itself. How do Western institutions themselves actively retard the development of local institutions? First, let's examine what their real incentives here are, which is these institutions are universities, often commercial enterprises, or governments. Their interest is in a self-sustaining, their interest is not for a self-sustaining educational and cultural institution in those countries, because that would be a direct financial threat to their interests. So the sort of narrative that they give when they market these things, or when they actively recruit these people, is one that says, this is what you need. This is about the fact that rejecting this world, rejecting this would require showing that the Western universities and governments operate counter to their financial interests. So what is it that they go about doing? First of all, in regards to recruitment, we would say that they select for things that are not just about how useful would you, how effective or successful would you be in the course of that particular degree. They select for things like your family name, are you part of a dynasty? Because that is the best assurance they have that you will bring prestige to their institution because you're very likely to form part of the government of that country in the future. That perversely selects for people who have the least interest in developing a durable local institution in those countries. Secondly, we would say that once these elites are in power and they have many Western networks rather than local networks, and affiliations with Western commercial interests rather than local ones, the incentive is for them to either bring in foreign films or probably just shoot foreign films in that country that are about, this often tacitly, about colonial narratives that endorse narratives of white supremacy, which obviously is a harm in and of itself, but also displaces the opportunities for local Indigenous industries to develop. Third, we would say it actively supports neoliberalism. And closing opposition tells us in the point of information this might be a necessary expedient bargain. If you can't beat them, join them. There's no other trading partners available. And we think opening government has already cast doubt on that claim. But what we would add is that a class of elites educated to accept the dominant neoliberal paradigm in which they're educated in the West, that group is in the best position to enact that ideology. And that occurs in a context where there are often deeply entrenched patronage networks in a moment, and those countries are already in a weak negotiating position. We think in that context this occurs harmfully, and I'll explain more in a moment.
Singapore is approximately 65% Chinese, 15% Indian, and 20% Malay. What language will be used in the courts in your counterfactual?
So, whatever the answer to that question is one that should be decided first and foremost by the people in that country. And if it happens to be English, we don't have an in-principle problem with that. What our in-principle problem is that the people who make the decision about it becoming English are the ones who are taught to value English and are more likely to believe that is the correct answer to the question based on their education and not on their experience growing up in that country. And that obviously applies literally to the question of the language and not to the accent with which it is spoken, which is a large part of the harms on the government bench. That is what the opposition needs to engage with. Second of all, on mechanisms. The construction of agendas at trade summits and negotiations will be shaped by these people, by this class of elites who are who obviously have a set of priorities. And second of all, the promotion of foreign educated individuals. We think the alternative here is a world where these countries might prioritize their autonomy such that they might join alliances with other post-colonial states in order to strengthen their bargaining position collectively and reject the false choice between their prosperity and their culture. We don't think neoliberalism is the right ideology, but if it was, it should not get this huge arbitrary advantage it gets by the West actively trying to poach up-and-coming young people in that country and give them a Western indoctrination before those people rise into the realm of government. Why do we think this harms the respect that people have for their own culture? Because it incorporates a bunch of markers that are irrelevant to cultural capacity and achievement. So that is to say the Western narrative of superiority and exceptionalism and the Whig view of history that as the West was successful, that was because of arbitrary descriptions that were attached to Western people, such as their accent, such as their literature and their ideas, such as their architecture and such as their organizational practices, which are all constructed as a default against which the practices in an indigenous culture are compared. These are all premised on the continued weakness of that local education and literature, which constitutes a somewhat sort of imperative for this outsourcing. How does the West do that? First, obviously it is the seller of a set of products, so it gets to define what problem they're solving and the way in which they solve them, but also because of the starting gate advantage that has been conceded by these teams. Those commercial incentives and the savior ideology lead to a sense in which the people in that country begin to buy into the idea that they are ranked inferior. That is about self-respect and confidence in that country. There is a false comparison in this debate between democracy as practiced today in 2018 in many Western countries and the real achievable governments of many countries in Africa which are post-colonial. We think it is about, the key element of any set of institutions is self-ownership. That is, the ability of that country and its countrymen and women to decide the values they most prioritize. The West is a nefarious influence in these circumstances. Self-ownership is the key element, and that is precisely what the opposition benches deny. That is why we're proud to propose.
And now representing closing opposition, I invite member of opposition to the podium. Here.
What all other teams in this debate seem to have ignored is the fact that many post-colonial states are not organic but are the products of artifice. They are a patchwork of indigenous cultures and identities that have been haphazardly cobbled together by the terrible project of colonialism. Our thesis, unique to closing opposition, is that the deliberate westernization of culture spearheaded by elites, for example by speaking English, by wearing suit and tie to the finals of debate tournaments, is important in creating a lowest common denominator that allows for a more inclusive national narrative. We're going to forward three areas of extension. Firstly, explicitly the comparative. We're going to prove explicitly what happens on their side is that people default to ethnic ties and patronage networks within the domestic elite circles. Secondly, we're going to prove that westernized elites can actually spearhead a more inclusive national identity. Last of all, we're going to discuss why we create solidarity between various post-colonial states. But before that, I'm just going to deal a bit with the clash coming from opening half about legal systems. Sure, we agree that there might be value towards indigenous conceptions of law, but we can also agree that there is a bare minimum of concepts such as fair trial and rule of law which are enforced, generally speaking, by Western institutions where these people are likely to be studying. Moreover, having access to a pool of, for example, legal precedent and legal cases and being able to engage in the language and the legal framework through these take place allows people to negotiate the limits of their indigenous culture and where it fits in with Western legal canon. We don't think this is a big problem, and we don't see why indigenous culture is precluded just purely on the basis of language from coming into law. Then closing government tells us that indigenous industries are going to be quashed and Western powers will take advantage of them, like for example in film. First of all, they suggested that indigenous cultures can, through some kind of organic process, decide that they want to use English, which means the harms are fairly symmetric, and also they're crossing the house. Secondly, we think there's a countervailing incentive for local producers to use the colonial medium to make their culture marketable internationally. We're talking about things like, for example, Hollywood films and actors that focus on indigenous cultures. So we don't think that westernization of elites is necessarily lead to the death of indigenous cultures. If anything, it makes them more internationally marketable in a manner that fuses indigenous aspects along with Western elements. Moreover, the alternative on their side is that many of these local films will just be consigned to irrelevance because they'll only be marketable within their own countries. But okay, even if this results in fewer local institutions and local films, we're happy to concede that because, as I'll show, the comparative harm on our side is that people define themselves sharply on ethnic terms, which is harmful to the project of nation building in many of these fledgling societies. I'm going to move on to that now when I discuss the comparative. We'll also explicitly deal with the arguments that they brought up about inferiority on both opening and closing government. The key underlying assumption in this debate thus far is that there's some kind of primordial indigenous indigenous identity that remains a unifying force in post-colonial societies. CG tells us in particular that we can arrive at an organic idea of what the national language or what the national narrative will be in the absence of westernization. They never really gave us a reason why, especially given that elites and majority races in many of these countries continue to hold power and decide national narratives and national history via incredibly undemocratic means. This is just not true for the vast majority of post-colonial states where this debate happens. Many of them contain a patchwork of different networks and cultures with little connection to each other. And here are some systemic reasons for this. First of all, because Western imperialists often drew arbitrary borders that were bequeathed to their consequent post-colonial states. Good examples include Indonesia, for example, a state that has like 42 major ethnic groups, none of which have any unifying history or substantial unifying history to craft a national narrative. Secondly, and more insidiously, Western colonialists deliberately played up ethnic rivalries in order to divide and conquer, like the Belgians and what they did in Rwanda. By the way, in the opening house, there was this debate about, Robin gave a POI about whether or not Rwanda is a good example for either side. I would like to consider the alternative if Rwanda had remained under the governance of the Hutus and the Tutsis, without at least a unifying framework of French to unify both sides. No, thank you. So what would have happened in nations without the westernization of elites? First of all, ethnic elites would default to their own networks of patronage and language and communities. Instead of going to English universities, for example, the Chinese elites, which constitute 60% of people, the majority in Singapore, would have defaulted to Chinese and dialect clan associations for community and support. It is not clear, therefore, that national identity would become organically determined in the event that elites were not subject to westernization. This is the comparative claim that individuals would default to their own patronage networks and their own forms of community and support. Then they said Western institutions, like Harvard, for example, from closing government, will select for people in positions of power, and therefore the process will be unmeritocratic. You know what is worse? Letting local communities select their own leaders, because then they will choose people from the same race who have similar backgrounds as them, and these are sharply defined, even more so on ethnic grounds. So the world they create on their side is a world where communities and politicians explicitly play up ethnic rivalries within these indigenous cultures. For example, by only campaigning in a single language, trying to stir up rivalries because the national narrative remains fractured. But okay, if you're going to say that we haven't proven the comparative, I'll prove it now. Secondly, why does a westernized elite create a more inclusive national identity? We know elites and the language that they speak, for example, play an important role in shaping national identity via a number of methods. First of all, as opening government concedes, they often decide educational policies. So for example, we have more inclusive schools that don't teach particular ethnic languages, but rather teach a lowest common denominator language of the colonial power. Secondly, because elites also control the language and norms of national discourse, for example, via the media and reporting. Yes?
So, in Rwanda, French is merely served as a fig leaf to cover up the ethnic tensions that are already there. Whereas in Indonesia, when the national ideology is based on a more indigenous culture, greater national reconciliation was actually achieved.
Okay, so obviously, if the national language, yes, it might cover up certain underlying ethnic divides, but having a national language define either one of these languages will obviously make things worse because you explicitly favor one language above the other. It is not clear to me what the alternative on their side is. So we think that elites also control, for example, the language and the norms of national discourse. Bear in mind that, for example, English mediums can be adopted to a local context, like news reports in Singapore, for example, can focus on local politics rather than like the Queen of England. So it's not necessarily true that this leads to a greater imposition of colonial culture. What we create on our side is a language and a series of norms that are the most inclusive. And I think a great example of this is India, where the common language of English sidesteps the need to explicitly pick and choose which one of the many Indian languages becomes a national language, and a common history of resistance against colonialism and a common history of colonial institutions sidesteps the fact that this nation is created largely by patchwork and by an accident of colonialism and a terrible project of imperialism embarked by these countries. But my third area of extension will focus on solidarity between former colonial states. Note that this is very important, and this is just as important as creating a national identity, because many of these fledgling democracies are still in the process of nation building. Many of them are threatened externally as well as existentially. We admit that post-colonial states still have huge differences, but we allow for more of these countries and their citizens to find common ground. First of all, because obviously leaders speak the same language, it's fairly trivial. But secondly, because of ease of migration between these countries, which creates things like economic interdependence. It actually helps that many of these former colonies are often once in the same geographical area colonized by the same European country, because the geographical proximity allows, if they share a common language, for more transference of elites between these countries. What are the benefits? First of all, it allows them to negotiate as a bloc if they have greater economic ties. And secondly, it reduces the risk of interstate conflict between these states if they are more economically interdependent. So, the explicit comparative we point out is not that everyone feels inferior, but particular vulnerable minority groups feel inferior, dealing directly with the extension from closing government. All the harms that they talk about of inequality across the government bench are exacerbated, just that they're concentrated on individuals which did not have the chance to be the majority ethnic group within these countries. We're very proud to stand in closing opposition.
And now to conclude the case for the government bench, I invite Government Whip to the podium here.
I want to begin by directly rebutting the extension that we just heard. The central claim is that often countries were formed that did not have anything in common with another. There were multiple warring ethnic or religious groups that really should not have been a nation in the first place. And what the colonizers did was give them a useful framework to cover that up. The question that I would ask is, why did those countries stay together? They were placed as countries arbitrarily because the colonizers left, and in the process of repair, in the process of getting out as fast as they could, and in their arrogance, they randomly drew lines on the map, said this is what you are as a country, then demanded they be governed by one government, which was ruled by usually ruled by the ethnic majority, taking the guise of the colonizers. The problem is that could have been reformed. There's nothing inherent about where national boundaries or national lines are drawn. But the presence of elites who had the perception of cultural superiority, who gave the fig leaf that closing opposition wanted, meant that you never got that circumstance of reform. And we are still feeling the backlash of that in many of these countries. In areas worse affected by civil strife, interreligious or inter-ethnic conflict, they should have been reformed, and they should be different places. They should be different countries with different names. But colonial elites left there, and the colonial superiority that told them that those were what the nations should be did not allow for that reform. But the second thing to say is that this does not actually fix the problem that they identify. Like the example they give is pretty trivial, the idea that a court would need a common language. But the solution to some people not being able to speak the majority language, the solution to that problem should not be to give nobody any of what they want, right? Like the opposition strategy here approaches what a parent does when two kids are fighting over a toy, and you just take the toy away. The thing about that, it's not a conflict mediation strategy, it's a punishment. When you give nobody anything of what they want, you make it far more likely that groups will conflict because they still assume that the other side is the reason that their ethnic or religious group is not being represented in that legislation. And what that means is that you have far more likely conflict because instead of one side being aggravated, you have both sides being aggravated. We were the team that created a meaningful path for reform for states with meaningful sectarian divides, and even if we weren't, the opposition absolutely did not fix the problem that they wanted to identify. The rest of that closing opposition speech is pretty simple. One of them is that these guys will make friends in Hollywood and they'll come over and make movies, which is the most trivial benefit in the world. But also, I don't know, do you guys see the new Avatar movie? It sucked. I think realistically, at best, this is very marginal. At worst, it leads to wide-scale trivialization of the importance of these cultures. I'm not totally confident that Hollywood, who are definitely people that don't respect these places, are good exporters of culture. The final thing we hear in kind of the dying moments is because everybody speaks English, it's much easier to migrate. In the first instance, that is contingent upon stable and durable institutions of law enforcement that can exploit that. We explain in our extension why that's not true. In the second instance, that at best creates a problem of a brain drain, which then means that people are worse off. In whipping this debate, I want to ask a few questions. I'm going to begin briefly by looking at economic development, then I'm going to look at culture and institutions. Firstly, on economic development. A live question in this debate has been whether or not having people go overseas as ambassadors of sorts and making friendships are then effective in being able to bring back business home. We tell you that this is a catastrophic strategy that has led to the wide-scale selling off of many important natural resources, ports, and the like of these countries. We tell you in the first instance that it is not obvious that capitalism is an appropriate route for these countries. They are still developing and that project has failed them. But in the second instance, we describe that this is not capitalism in a pure form, but rather it is capitalism in a context in which these governments are still relatively corrupt and they are in an incredibly bad negotiating context, and the representatives are people who went to Harvard and Oxford, made friends with the people on the other side of the table, are friends with them, have relatively less sympathy than they, who grew up in the United States, have for their own country. And that is why this leads to the widespread and wide-scale selling off of economic institutions in these countries that have harmed development and harmed the quality of life in these countries. Never mind the fact that it hasn't happened autonomously, it's happened far less efficiently and led to far less graft, which means when you're considering the question about what this does to culture and institutions, you need to weigh that against the economic mismanagement this policy's caused. Opening.
So if you let post-colonial countries splinter, they will probably get genocide over the vacant colonial ground. Is it not better to create a Western elite and elite closing opposition that can ban that infrastructure and direct the country along the correct path?
Man, that really reminds me of that meme where it's like premise 1, question mark, profit. Except in this case, it was premise 1, question mark, genocide. Like, what the hell are you talking about, mate? I'm not rebutting that. It literally, like, I don't even get it. Like, if you split up a country and you divide it between ethnic groups, then they're in separate countries. And given that they're in separate countries and being given exactly what they want, their incentive for genocide is like 0. I don't know, mate. You get a donut. So, on culture in this debate. We explain, basically, I think there's a split between us and our opening here, because our opening does explain usefully that the people that go to these places don't have much sympathy because of their university. We give you a far richer conception of how this plays out that effectively deals with the way opening opposition wants to talk about it. We describe how the aspirations of these people are framed around Western institutions, how their media consumption is framed around Western institutions and Western desires, and how their language and cultural habits are shaped around the things they'll need to know in Western educational institutions, like the study of Shakespeare. And what that means is that these people, when they enter the institution of being the elite, have internalized a cultural attitude that is firmly far better for them. So on institutions. Opening opposition says, essentially, that you need to know how to manage Western institutions because they were the ones left over by the colonizers. What we wanted to do was establish new institutions or go back to institutions that had previously existed. Dan gives you 5 things here, none of which get any response from the opposition. The fact that this saps national confidence and pride in a circumstance in which you don't have leaders who are seen to respect those institutions themselves. The fact that you have perverse institutional incentives from foreign universities and foreign governments to play down the importance of your culture to encourage you to keep leaving. The fact that the media specifically invites these people to do that so that they are able to sell more Western products. The fact that these people are far less immersed in that culture, as I previously described to you. And as a function of all of those things, the fact that these people do not have respect for the places that they have come from. And the conclusion of that is that you end up with institutions of government, institutions of law, institutions of business that do not reflect what is ultimately for the best for these countries. And in doing so, you inhibit their ability to feel a sense of national pride, you inhibit their ability to have a sense of stability because their institutions do not speak to them, and you inhibit the ability of these people to be genuinely represented in the institutions that speak for them. Look, I by far have the weakest identity politics claim in this debate of anyone, but I am still relatively proud to propose.
And now to deliver the last speech of this debate and the 2018 TOC, we'd like to hear from Opposition Whip here.
At the turn of the 20th century, the colonial project left countries like my homeland Singapore unrecognizable. Singapore is an artificial construct. It is because of the British that my grandparents migrated from Hainan Dao, repopulating what was once a majority indigenous Malay island. Our case is that when you have a territory riven by racial and religious fault lines, elite emphasis on indigenous identities leads to racialized politics and exclusionary treatment. I am going to use the problems of each of the other teams in this debate to structure my speech. First, I'm going to talk to you about OG's missing counterfactual. Second, I'm going to talk to you about OO's missing mechanism. And third, I'm going to talk to you about CG's missing engagement. First, on OG's missing counterfactual. And I think what we need to ask is what would have happened if the elites did not consume Western media? And I think the counterfactual looks very much like Malaysia, where the Bumi elite defends policies of Malay chauvinism and uses Melayu as a national language. And now, to be clear, this is fine if everyone in Malaysia were Malay, but that's just not true. Like, post-colonial countries had diversity imposed on them by the drawing of arbitrary borders and colonial migration. And the problem is that elites tend to exploit exclusively come from one or a very few set of ethno-religious groups, for example, the Chinese elite in Singapore. And the reason why is because of colonial distributions of power and privilege. For example, in Singapore, the British deliberately used divide and rule tactics to grant social political power to the Chinese to the exclusion of the Malays. And there are two reasons why this counterfactual is likely. Reason one is what Robin tells you about the self-interested elite. There is a vested interest to keep cultural hegemony to themselves because this is in itself a form of soft power that keeps them ahead. The second reason is all the small points that Arthur told you about how the elite wield great power to frame and to shape the default national identity. Unlike what CG asserts, the process of identity determination doesn't happen via referenda. It happens through what is written in people's textbooks. It happens through what songs children are exposed to. It happens to the language that you speak. All these are invisible frames that align your conception of the imagined community, CF Benedict Anderson, in a way that you don't have democratic control over. This is important because if you accept this comparison, we have already beaten OG. They told you about alienation from institutions. They told you about class divides. But if it is true that elites in post-colonial countries will default to pre-colonial cultural and linguistic arrangement, then these problems are even more acute in OG's paradigm. Robin tells us of the example of India. We would much rather have English-educated Rahul Gandhi in charge than the Hindu chauvinist Modi and the BJP leading to significant harms in a nation that is already riven by lots of ethno-religious strife. No, observe how this also deals with CG's extension on the ranking of cultures and ownership. Since at the point where the elite homogenizes their culture and imposes it into the mainstream, that's when there is even greater social-cultural exclusion. The deeper problem here, unlike what CG claimed, is that any determination of the indigenous is in itself political. Thailand, for example, has Siamese Chinese and Patani Muslim people, and the Patani Muslim people have inhabited these lands for about as long or even longer than the Siamese, but the elite in Thailand happen to be Siamese and Chinese. How is the process of negotiation going to work? Hint. The Patani Muslims are going to be ignored. As in the status quo, they are forced to speak Thai. They are forced to conform to the mainstream cultural hegemony. Now let's deal more precisely with what CG rebutted, right? They said, first of all, why, Chin, should these countries stay together? Response, because of the damage of separation and devolution. We saw this happen in the period of partition in 1947. We saw this happen with the independence of South Sudan in 2012. We saw this happen with Indonesia invading East Timor in the 1990s. The problem is that CG seems to think that negotiation over national borders, identity, and shared resources can be achieved by holding hands and singing Kumbaya. No! This is an expensive process that is paid in blood and dust, and your jokes are not going to erase the people who have died as a result of this conflict because shared resources are necessarily mutually exclusive. The second thing that CG told me is that, oh no, but what happens now, Chin, is that you give nobody what they want. Isn't it better to give one side what they want? No, I have 3 responses. No, thank you. I'm good. And here's where I move into my, OO's rebuttal on their missing mechanism. I have 3 responses. First, a particular language and culture, as much as it is intimate to one group, also serves and carries deep historical baggage and trauma that predates colonial rule. For example, Cantonese versus Mandarin in Hong Kong. Secondly, entire communities feel fundamentally excluded when they have to engage with civic society on the grounds of the privileged group. In order for me, for example, to be a successful politician in Malaysia, I'll need to first speak Malay, even if I'm Han Chinese. Just look at how Finance Minister Lim Guan Eng got skewered for publishing an official statement in Mandarin before he published it in Malay. And we think that's really important to consider. Third of all, an indigenous language and culture lends closer affinity with ethnocentric communities over the artificial boundaries of the nation state. This is why Tumbakas in Zambia see themselves as Tumbakas first and Zambians second, because there is no unifying norm or unifying cultural shared space that people can come together and then forge a national identity through. No, thank you. So clearly, CG are out of this debate.
Chin.
But before I go on, Imran, of course, opening.
China and its various ethnicities settle on the Mandarin language, which was created but based on the northern Chinese dialect, which is far more accessible for all the various Chinese ethnicities
I really
rather
don't,
than the imposition.
Thanks, Imran. I really don't want to say it here, but I guess I have to. But Mandarin damn shag, for people in Xinjiang and Tibet, and lots of marginalized minorities who feel that they can't be represented. Damn shag, for people who don't feel represented by the CCP. Damn shag, for people who are continually oppressed as a consequence of not being able to engage in the civic space. Damn shag, for Macau and Hong Kong. So if you want to use China as your best case scenario, I think you lose this debate, Imran. Okay, third, on CG's missing engagement. Why we achieve greater solidarity between former colonies. We heard them tell us that this causes wide-scale selling off of resources because of neoliberalism. Okay, no. This is not a neoliberalism problem. This is a corruption and stupidity problem. Look at Maduro and the sale of Venezuelan oil resources, even though he's probably further left than Brian Wong. And I love you, Brian, but you know this to be true. Like, this seems to indicate to us that the pathology of this fast sale of natural resources and gross mismanagement is not a consequence of culture being hegemonized by, the West, but rather a consequence of elite mismanagement. But you know what's worse? What's worse is when you have all the harms that Arthur told you about. When the elite gets to dictate the circumstances and conditions upon which minorities get to participate, that's when their power becomes even more accentuated in these communities, making it even easier for these resources to be sold off, especially given that they tend to be in the hands of certain ethnocentric communities that have held the land for long periods of time. So even by your metric, you lose. For all these reasons, I am so proud to oppose.
Another big hand for the great show by the 8 debaters, please. After hearing him, I'm not sure why I'm here. I studied 4 years in Canada. I studied English literature. I don't know Chinese to save my life, and I feel utterly wrong as a Singaporean not speaking Chinese at all. Thank you very much. Now, we would like to invite all the panelists to retire. Nico will bring you to the room. No. It's a cooler place. Huh? Oh, okay, go back there. Yeah. Go to the back. Yeah. It's time to calm down, reflect, and have a drink outside. Have some more egg tarts. As all you have been into the final, it takes a while to arrive at the correct decision. So at this point, we will have a long recess of about 40 minutes. Please come back here at 6. We will do the prize presentation. And many of you, about 20 of you, will be awarded with Best Speaker prizes. Please do come back at 6 o'clock. Thank you.